Alright, so for this next section, what we're going to take a look at is actually trying to implement some behavior for one of our buttons. So in order to do this, there are a couple of different things I need to talk about here. So the first thing is understanding exactly how we're going to approach this implementation process. Making sure that we understand that requires understanding the concept of event firing. So one of the things that is worth noting about our graphical user interfaces versus our console interfaces is that we don't necessarily have some particular piece of code that we must execute at any given moment. Instead, we have many kind of disjointed pieces of code that might execute depending on certain actions that the user takes. So it's not going to be just a very simple sequence of events anymore. Instead, what's going to happen is now the user will dictate when certain actions should take place. This is what's known as event-driven programming, so it's a little bit different from what we're more accustomed to seeing, where essentially we would write some code and then we would just execute that code one line after the other, just from top to bottom. It's a bit more dynamic than that. So to make sure that we understand exactly how this is going to work, we need to imagine two different things that we're going to be dealing with here. So the first one is going to be the actual button that we want to use. So imagine that we have some kind of button, say like our submit button that we're working with. Put that right there. And in addition to the submit button, there's also the action of the user clicking this button. So that action that they're taking, where they click the button, is another separate object or another separate entity that we also have to consider. So there's also this user click. So this user click is going to be what's known as an action event. So it's a very specific kind of event that's taking place. So we want to be able to capture that event, and whenever that event occurs, we can then go ahead and take some kind of action or execute some piece of code based on that. So in the case of a submit button, usually what you might expect is some code that's written that will then take say maybe a form of some kind and then send that off somewhere to, say, a database of some kind to be stored and later used by some other user at some other location. So the overall process of creating one of these buttons, we then want to go ahead and register to that button some event handling mechanism. So we got event registration, and then we also have the overall process of the event occurring, and then because of the registration, we actually handle it in some way. This overall process is what's going to be known as event firing. Okay. So there are a couple of different parts when it comes to the program itself that we now need to go ahead and take care of. So if we come back over here, so I've gone ahead and taken the code from my first GUI and just moved that into a new program. This one I've gone ahead and named simple form. So if you want to go ahead and make a project or a Java file and just call it simpleform.java, we can go ahead and set it up for that. Right here, I'm going to go ahead and modify the title for this to just call it simple form. And from here, I'm going to go ahead and start creating each one of the different elements that I'm going to need for handling this event. So there are going to be two classes that I need to add to this. So I need two more import statements. So this is going to come from JavaFX.event. So we're going to go into what is known as the event package. And from there, I need to get two different classes. The first one is going to be event handler. And for the second import, again, going into that event package, this one is to get an action event. All right. So the event handler is going to be used to actually create some event handler object that is used to, as the name would imply, handle the event. And then the action event class is going to be used to actually construct our objects of this action event class, of which a button click is one of them. Okay. So the next thing I need to do is to actually start making my code for this event handler. Basically, I'm just going to start writing some code that tells my program how to handle the submit button, this button that I have right here, being clicked, or in this case, based on the variable name that I gave it, this name button. Okay, so I'm going to take a couple of different approaches with this. For this particular video, what I'm going to focus on first is probably the most straightforward, based on what we've seen before. One of the most straightforward approaches we could take to creating this event handler part of the program. And the way I'm going to do that is going to be with what is known as a private inner class. And basically what this is it's going to be a class that is contained inside of another class, and it's also made private. So it's going to use that private access specifier, and then it's going to be a class. So it's going to be private class, and in this case I can give it any name that I'd like. For this particular one, because this is related to the name button, more precisely it's dealing with a button for submission of this form, I'm going to go ahead and call this submit event. Or better yet, we'll call it submit action, since this is going to be the action that we take whenever the submit event is occurring. Okay. And in this case, I'm going to need to introduce yet another keyword. So kind of like what we saw with extends, where I'm using that to go grab some behaviors or some functionality from the application class and be able to use that with this class here. I need to be able to do the same thing here. One other thing to note is that if you're copying and pasting this, make sure that you also go ahead and change this name to simple form as well, so it matches the name of the file. Okay, so I'm going to do something similar here. The difference is that instead of using the word extends, now I'm going to use the word implements. And eventually I'll come back to explain a little bit more about precisely what the distinction is between extends and implements is. To give you a very basic sort of overview explanation of it, this application is going to be a class, whereas with implements, the thing that I'm going to be putting here, which is this event handler is not actually a class. Event handler is what is known as an interface, which is somewhat similar to a class, but there's going to be a very crucial difference that I'll describe a little bit later on whenever we get into that in inheritance, which will be a much later chapter for the course. So for right now, we'll just go ahead and say that we're going to implement or do implements event handler. And then the other thing I want to do is also specify the kind of event that this particular event handler needs to handle. And the way that I'm going to do that is by using this pair of angular brackets. And inside of this, I'm going to specify an action event. So this basically says that I want to make submit action, which is going to implement my event handler interface specifically for action events. Okay. The next thing I'm going to need inside of here is going to be a method that's related to this particular interface. So this is going to be a method that's coming from event handler, and I need to go ahead and actually define that method and give it some kind of functionality. It's very similar to the start method that came from the application class that I had to go ahead and give some kind of behavior to. So for this particular one, we're going to do public void handle. So this is going to be the handle method that came from this event handler interface. And then I need to pass in a parameter for this. This one's going to be taking the action event. And we're going to call this one just event. Okay. All right. So then the next thing I want to do is actually start specifying what it is that I want to do whenever this event is occurring. So in this particular case, what I expect this to do is to actually display some content to me inside of the application window. And in order to display that content, what I need to do is start to modify the controls, the set of controls that I've specified for this application, so that I can actually include another control that's going to end up holding the content that I display a little bit later on. So the way that I'm going to do this is that I want to add another label to this, and I want to be able to modify that label a little bit later on. So I'm going to make another label, and this is one I'll just call something like output label, and say this is equal to a new label that is initially empty. So I'm just going to give it a pair of double quotation marks and then just not put anything inside of that. Okay. And so then what I want to go ahead and do right here is to go ahead and modify this label so that I can actually put some text inside of it. So we'll start off with something fairly simple. So we're going to go ahead and grab that output label, and we're going to use a particular method on it, which is going to be the setText method. So the setText method is what we can actually use to change the content of a label whenever we need to. So it's initially going to be empty, and then when we click the button, we're going to be able to set the text with this. So we'll just say something like the text is changed for now. Okay. So do something fairly trivial like that. The next thing I need to go ahead and do is to also make sure that this is actually contained in some kind of layout or some kind of container within the scene. Otherwise, it's not actually going to be a part of it, and it's not going to display. So right now I have an HBox for my name label, my name text field, and my name button. I want to go ahead and add the output label, but ideally I want to put the output label underneath these. So in order to do that, there's a particular thing that I'm going to start doing with my containers here, which is I'm going to start putting one container inside of another. So to show you what I mean by that, we say that we have our HBox for these three items right here. I then want to go ahead and underneath that create a VBox, and this VBox will be a new VBox. And for this one, I'm going to still keep it at 10 pixels of spacing. So this will be between this HBox and this output label. So at this point now, what I've done, if we want to try to imagine the structure of this, go ahead and erase everything here. So imagine that we've created our container. So this is going to be our VBox. So we see our VBox has two different parts. So the top part is the HBox, the bottom part is going to be the output label, and then for the HBox, we've got three different components for that. So that's going to be for our name label, our name text field, and our name button. Okay, so this is the general approach that I've taken here. And then for this part right here, we'll change this so that the VBox is the one that's actually being centered now, since the VBox has become the root node of the scene. We'll go ahead and modify that within the constructor for our scene. And up here, I'll go ahead and make sure that I add an additional import so that we can go ahead and bring in that VBox as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and compile this just as it is right now and try to run it. See if I have any mistakes up to this point. This was simpleform.java. Okay, so one of the notable issues right now is that I've specified output label. I declared that within the start method that is separate from this private class. So these two things have their own scope, meaning that I need to go ahead and fix this a little bit. So ideally what I should do instead is take this and we'll go ahead and place it in the global scope, and then also for security's sake we'll make sure that this is private. So we'll just do a private label, output label, that we can do within the scope of the entire class. That way then this is going to be accessible both within the start method and also within this private inner class. So I'll go ahead and try that again now. Okay, so now this will actually work, or at least it compiles properly. We'll then go ahead and run this. So everything is running. We'll click submit, and nothing is happening. Okay, so this shows us a little bit of an issue already. So let's see if we can go ahead and try to fix that. So go ahead and close that, and come over here. So at this point now, what I've done so far is I've created my event handler, but I've not yet established which button this event handler should be associated with, meaning that I haven't registered it to a button. So we can't just assume because I've created an event handler that that just applies to a particular button. We need to be able to directly associate one button with one event handler, or maybe several buttons with a single event handler. In this particular case, I want to make sure that the name button actually has the submit action registered to it. So to do that, we need one additional line of code here. So I'm going to go ahead and grab that name button and do a SetOnAction. So we're going to use this method SetOnAction. This is going to be used to say, okay, whenever we click this button, or whenever some action is performed on this button, this is the particular event handler that we want to go ahead and execute for it. So right here, I'm going to go ahead and make a new object of the submit action class. So because this is a class, I need to construct objects of it. So we're going to say new submit action. Go ahead and save that. And now, because I've actually done this registration for it, now whenever I click the name button, it's going to check to see what action it should take, in this case the submit action, and it's going to go ahead and execute this, these lines of code that have been specified in this handle method. Okay, so I'll go ahead and compile that and run it. And so now if I click the submit button, we can see the text is changed right underneath here. Okay. All right. Let's see. So looking at this right now, I think I'm going to go ahead and make sure that this H box is still being centered properly. Go ahead and keep my V box, but also go ahead and make sure that my H box is being aligned correctly. Okay. Alright, so now the next thing I want to go ahead and do is to modify the behavior and handle a little bit so that this is a bit more interesting or a bit more dynamic. So right now, ideally the expectation here might be if we want to at least see a message that's associated with the text field that we've created, maybe we want to go ahead and take the content of that text field and actually display that to the user. So the way that we could do that is we've got our output label, we're setting the text to something like this. So maybe instead of using this message right here, instead what I could do is say something like, your name is, and then go ahead and concatenate to this some content, some text that we get from that text field. So I want to go ahead and grab that text field and then say get text. So this get text method is going to be used to take a look at the text field, see what text is inside of it, and then go ahead and fetch that or return that to this call that we make to the method. So in this case, what it's going to do is say your name is, and say for example I put my name, Brandon Earwood, as the text for that, then it'll just display that to fill out the rest of that label. Another thing to take note of here is that because I've specified the name text field within the scope of this handle method in our submit action, our private inner class, I'm going to have to do the same thing that I did for my output label. So I'm going to go ahead and take this and just place this right underneath my label. So I'm going to have a private text field called name text field. This is just going to be equal to a new text field object. I've moved all of that into the global scope or the class level scope for my simple form. And so then we can go ahead and save that. And then we can go ahead and compile this and run it. Okay, so at this point now, as we can see, I've kind of fixed the alignment for this, so it's back in the center. I'll put my name in right here, click submit, and now we can see it displaying as expected. And if I were to modify this, say I remove my last name from it and I click submit again, it'll go ahead and modify the text in that label as well. There's just one problem with this right now though, which is that if I delete all of the text inside of this and just leave it empty and click submit, it's going to go ahead and print out the text for that label, but it's just going to have a sort of blank space at the end because I didn't put any text inside of it. And preferably I'd rather it not do this. So I'm going to go ahead and make one last modification to this so that it doesn't really do this sort of thing anymore. So I'm going to go ahead and close that and come back over here. And the one last thing I want to go ahead and do is just do a little check to see whether or not there's actually any text inside of that text field. And the easiest way to do that is to just go ahead and get the text in that text field. So we're going to grab our name text field. We'll get the text inside of it. And then because of the fact that the text that we're getting from that, it's being returned as a string, we can go ahead and apply any methods that we could apply to a string right here. And so one of the things I could do is just to go ahead and check the length of that string. So go ahead and get that, and then say, as long as that's not equal to 0, then we can go ahead and do this. So basically the way this will work is if the length is not 0, meaning that we actually wrote something inside of that text field, then we'll go ahead and execute that. If it is equal to 0, meaning that we didn't put anything there, then we're just going to go ahead and ignore this line and not try to execute this. So I'll go ahead and save it like that. Let's go ahead and compile it and run it. And so now if I put my name in here, this will still work just as it did before. But then if I delete this and I try to click the submit button again, it's not going to modify the text because of the fact that there's nothing in here anymore. Okay. All right, so at this point, this is going to wrap up the initial discussion that I wanted to have about setting up our button controls and dealing with events. So this whole process of event handling, event registration, and event firing. In the next video, I want to go into a little bit more depth about different ways to handle input and output with our buttons. Primarily what I want to focus on next, since we've looked at set text with labels, the next thing I want to take a look at is being able to set images by essentially modifying an image view to display one image and then change to displaying another image through a button click.